On May 31, 2009, Air France Flight 447, an Airbus A330, was on its way from Rio de Janeiro to Paris when it encountered a series of catastrophic events that would lead to one of the most tragic accidents in the history of aviation. The flight, carrying 216 passengers and 12 crew members, started smoothly, but shortly after, the aircraft encountered dangerous weather conditions and experienced critical system failures that led to its tragic end. This is the story of that ill-fated flight and the events that unfolded before the disaster. The evening of May 31, 2009, began like any other transatlantic flight. Air France Flight 447, an Airbus A330 with the registration FGZCP, departed Rio de Janeiro's Galeão Airport at 10:29 p.m. Following a delayed departure at 10:10 p.m. on board were 216 passengers and 12 crew members, including a captain, 2 co-pilots, and a cabin crew. The flight began without incident, and the crew settled into their usual routines for a long-haul flight. By midnight, the aircraft was cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet. The cockpit environment was calm, with the autopilot and autothrust systems engaged to maintain the course and altitude. The crew worked together as they monitored the systems, preparing for a smooth journey across the Atlantic. However, the weather conditions soon changed as the aircraft approached the Intertropical Convergence Zone, ITCZ, an area known for its severe weather patterns, including thunderstorms and turbulence. Around 1:35 a.m., as the aircraft reached a waypoint, the crew switched to high-frequency communication with the Atlantic Oceanic Control Center, ACC. They successfully conducted a communication test but struggled to establish a connection with Dakar Oceanic Control Center. At this point, the crew adjusted the navigation display scale, reducing it from 320 to 160 nautical miles. As they passed through an area of potential turbulence, the crew discussed the possibility of facing challenging weather ahead. The captain acknowledged the risk of the weather conditions ahead and noted difficulties with climbing higher due to high temperatures, which made ascending to flight level 370 unfeasible. At 1:45 a.m., the aircraft encountered turbulence near the Salu waypoint, which was consistent with earlier warnings from the airline's operations control center about convective weather in the ITCZ. The crew took necessary precautions by dimming the cockpit lights and activating external lighting to prepare for the rough conditions. Although the turbulence intensified as the aircraft entered a thick cloud layer, it was not yet severe. The pilots discussed the worsening weather and the possibility of climbing higher, but they remained at their current altitude. Despite the conditions, the crew continued to monitor the situation carefully, with one of the co-pilots noting that the altitude restriction due to temperature would likely persist. Around 2 a.m., after a brief lull in the turbulence, one of the co-pilots remarked that the temperature-related altitude restriction would likely continue. The captain, who had been resting, returned to the cockpit and joined the 2 co-pilots in discussing the situation. They decided to make a slight course change, veering 12 degrees to the left, and activated the weather radar, adjusting the gain to its maximum setting to gain a clearer view of the approaching weather. The turbulence began to intensify, and at 2:06 a.m., the PF, pilot flying, warned the cabin crew about the rough conditions ahead. The aircraft's speed was reduced to Mach 0.8, and the engine anti-ice system was turned on, with the crew bracing for what appeared to be a more turbulent phase of the flight. Without warning, at 2:10 a.m. and 5 seconds, the autopilot and autothrust systems disengaged, triggering a loss of control. The PF immediately took manual control of the aircraft, making adjustments to try and stabilize the situation. However, despite the efforts, the aircraft began to roll to the right. The pilots struggled to regain control, and the stall warning briefly activated, signaling that the aircraft was about to lose control. The aircraft's airspeed dropped drastically, with the left primary flight display showing only 60 knots, while the Integrated Standby Instrument System, ISIS, also displayed erroneous data. The aircraft was now in a dangerous state, as its flight control laws shifted from normal to alternate mode, making it more difficult to manage. The pilots struggled to regain control, working frantically to stabilize the aircraft, but the flight director failed to respond, and the displays lost their crossbars. As the aircraft's speed and altitude fluctuated wildly, the pilots continued to fight to control the aircraft. One of the co-pilots warned that they had lost airspeed readings and were now in alternate law protections, which further complicated their efforts to regain control. In a desperate bid to recover, the PF made extreme control inputs, swinging the side stick from stop to stop. However, the aircraft's pitch continued to increase, reaching 11 degrees within moments. As the situation worsened, the aircraft began to climb, reaching 37,000 feet, while the pilots struggled to reduce the pitch angle. Despite applying maximum thrust in an effort to regain control, the aircraft remained unmanageable. The stall warning continued to sound, and the pilots' attempts to counter the aircraft's erratic movements were unsuccessful. By the time the captain returned to the cockpit, the aircraft was in a dire state. The airspeed data had become invalid, and the stall warning persisted. The crew's frantic efforts to regain control were in vain, and the Airbus A330 ultimately entered a fatal descent. The final moments were chaotic, with the crew unable to resolve the technical malfunctions or recover the aircraft, leading to its tragic crash into the Atlantic Ocean. The investigation into the crash would raise questions about the flight crew's actions and the events leading to the disaster. According to Air France's operational manuals and regulations, the flight crew had been augmented with an additional co-pilot due to the long duration of the flight. The crew consisted of 2 co-pilots, one of whom was seated in the right seat to serve as the captain's relief. The flight had departed Paris on May 28, 2009, and had arrived in Rio de Janeiro later that evening. Each of the crew members had extensive qualifications, including the captain, a 58-year-old veteran with over 10,000 flying hours, and the 2 co-pilots, one with over 6,500 hours and the other with nearly 3,000 hours. Despite their experience, unforeseen circumstances and technical failures during the flight ultimately led to the tragedy. The Airbus A330, which had been in service since 2005, had accumulated 18,870 flight hours and had undergone regular maintenance, including routine checks. The aircraft had no prior issues, and a minor VHF radio problem was resolved by ground engineers before departure. The crew was fully qualified and experienced, and the aircraft was within its weight limits. However, environmental factors, including the presence of ice crystals at high altitudes, caused the pressure sensors to malfunction, disrupting the aircraft's airspeed readings and contributing to the loss of control. The investigation into the crash revealed that the malfunctioning pressure sensors caused a loss of airspeed data, which led to the disengagement of the autopilot and a series of missteps by the flight crew. Although the stall warning system had activated, the crew failed to acknowledge it promptly, which compounded the crisis. The lack of coordination between the pilots and the absence of clear communication and task sharing exacerbated the situation, preventing the crew from performing the necessary recovery actions. The Air France Flight 447 disaster highlighted several key issues in aviation safety, including the growing reliance on automation, crew coordination, and manual flying skills. While automation has undoubtedly improved safety during routine flight operations, it can also create vulnerabilities when pilots are less prepared to handle extreme conditions that require manual intervention. In this case, the failure of the automation to respond to the rapidly deteriorating conditions left the pilots ill-prepared to regain control of the aircraft. The malfunctioning stall warning system and the conflicting readings from the aircraft's instruments further confused the pilots, delaying their recognition of the stall and exacerbating the crisis. The crash of Flight 447 underscored the dangers of human error in aviation, particularly in situations where pilots are faced with rare and unpredictable weather conditions, misleading technology readings, and insufficient experience. The incident highlighted the need for pilots to quickly recognize and respond to dangerous conditions, especially when dealing with high-altitude stalls, ice-related malfunctions, and rapidly changing weather patterns. Despite advances in aviation technology, the tragedy served as a sobering reminder that pilot training, clear communication, and the ability to adapt under pressure are essential to ensuring flight safety. In the aftermath of the crash, the investigation prompted significant changes in aviation safety protocols, crew training, and cockpit technology, aiming to prevent similar accidents in the future. It raised concerns about the over-reliance on automation and the importance of maintaining manual flying skills, even during routine flights. The lessons learned from Flight 447